When a gazelle is chased, it experiences a similar response to a threat as humans do. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol surge through its body, help it run as fast as possible to safety. Once it reaches safety, the gazelle may run, skip, jump, play, or jump in water to release the energy created by the stress hormones. This process is called physically discharging energy. I found it so fascinating. Gazelles can run up to speeds of 65 kilometers per hour when chased. They can maintain a high speed longer than cheetahs. Cheetahs can only sprint for about 0.28 miles. So, they have all of these different, they zigzag. They have all these different means of protecting themselves to escaped predators. But what I find the most fascinating about gazelles is that after they've gone through all this and this process of physically discharging energy, they go right back to grazing. They don't ponder, they don't hold on to what happened and continue to, because this is their life. They have realized, and this is how they survive, but they have recognized and realized that there's always going to be predators out there. When we are talking about humans, we're not able to do that. When something stressful happens to us where we start to get that fight or flight, or all those hormones start to get elevated because we are in a heightened state, we aren't able to come back and just go back to the things that we do. Now, I shouldn't say that. I believe that there are people who are able to continue moving forward. I was a witness to that recently. And I don't really want to speak to it until I've actually, spoken to this person, if I can reference them in this. But many of us are able to, yes, continue going on living our day-to-day lives. But are we present? Are we present? When you recognize that you have to make changes, or changes are necessary in order for you to live a fulfilling, healthy, happy life. That's the beauty of it. In these conversations I've been having and continuing to have about long-term substance abuse, opioid use disorder, and, alcoholism, I have found that every single person who has shared this story, there was a moment. And it wasn't as if the moment was something terrible happened to make them realize that they had to make a change. But they got to this moment where they recognized, I can't do this anymore. Or I'm going to lose my children. Or I'm going to die. Or all of these things. They recognize that the way that they're living their life is not sustainable. When you're looking from the outside in and you're trying so desperately as a family member or a friend of someone who abuses substances, you want so desperately for them to see it from your lens, but unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. I've personally been experiencing something like this recently with a family member, and it's hard because of what I've been talking about on the podcast and all of this knowledge that I have now. I have almost been the mediator of this situation to where I'm like, listen, this person who we all care about has to be the one that wants to go and knows why they want to go. And whether they may realize it or not, we are doing all these things because we care. It's hard to hold back your frustrations and your anger because of how they're acting, right? But it's so necessary. But when is enough enough? And when is it like, listen, you've got to go get help? Because if you don't, something really terrible is going to happen. So to have these conversations means a lot to me, and I hope it means a lot to you. I know that there's more of you out there. I am shifting into some really powerful stories from females here in the coming months and some new topics, but really it's just a matter of us all realizing that we are all connected in our stories, in our triumphs, in our struggles. So today, again, such an amazing episode, sitting down with Dr. Brophy from the Gaiser Center. if this man has a subject brought in front of him that he knows anything about, he's just like so excited because he just loves helping people. And to sit down and talk to him again has always been such an honor. And with my good friend Josh Stanko, who was on last week's podcast, that was really just his story. This today is the three of us talking about naltrexone, really digging into that, what it is, the benefits of it. And, you know, we always want to let everybody know that no matter what, like, talk to your doctor, get the information, research it. Don't just take our word or his experience from it. Do your due diligence. You owe it to yourself. And then the other side of this is the Sinclair Method. If you're not familiar, I'm going to put a link in the caption. That's something that I'm just starting to look into, so I don't want to say anything more on it. Let's just get to this episode today with Dr. Brophy from the Gaiser Center and my good friend, Joshua Stanko. Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. For a long time, I suffered with depression and anxiety. I had tried therapy before, but struggled finding a therapist I connected with until I found BetterHelp. That's why I am so excited to share BetterHelp's mission to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, because finding a therapist can be hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online. Remote therapy sessions, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. Click the link in description and receive 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. And by clicking that link, you support this channel. Plus, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. I was struggling for a long time, and BetterHelp was where I found my therapist, Whitney, who I still see weekly for almost 2 years now. So, if you're struggling like I was, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in description or go to betterhelp.com/altereagle. That's betterhelp.com/altereagle. There's no better time than now to start your mental health journey. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel.
And led to some bad moments. You know, you realize that, you know, I was on the verge of losing probably my life. You know, my health was terrible. Losing my family, losing my son, breaks my heart. You know, so I realized I had to do something to get ahead of it. And thankfully, you know, this is the crux of, you know, reconnecting with Laura. Laura, I'm so grateful for this podcast. I do listen to it on the road when I'm working. I think it's incredible, you know, to get this stuff out there. Some understanding that there's a lot of help. And when you ask for help, there's a lot of people who want to be there for you. There's so much shame in it. But when you just put yourself out there in a very real way, you realize who already knew. You know, people are afraid to say that, and you end up with a really amazing community, and there's help. So now I'm hoping that I can put my story out there, be vulnerable in a way that will hopefully open that door for somebody else. If one other person will jump on board with what I've been doing, or anything that helps them, that's now become an incredibly important thing for me to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Josh, I just hearing a bit of your story, you probably don't know this, but that's actually quite relatable for me, because I also grew up in the service industry. You know, my family owned bars and restaurants. From the time I was 18 years old, I was working in those big warehouse nightclubs in the Strip District, and you know, when you're in that industry, particularly, you know, the service industry, as a bartender, you know, like it only took me a year and a half to work my way up from bar back to bartender. So, you know, at that point, I'm 19 years old and I'm behind a bar and I'm serving alcohol, and everybody behind the bar was also consuming alcohol. Yeah. You know, it was, you know, shots for those guys and a shot for us too, you know. Yeah. And even after we would close the bar and do last call at 1:45, well, that's typically when our night kind of started, you know. As I'm sure you can relate, that's how the service industry is, you know. And then you get together with other people in the service industry, and you're right, it becomes so many parts of your life: how you celebrate, how you handle stress, and you know, I was fortunate enough that I never became a daily drinker. I never had to experience things like alcohol withdrawal or anything like that. But, throughout my life, as I transitioned through college and then even medical school, like I realized that I was still embracing alcohol in a dangerous way. And eventually it led to a DUI. And that was a huge wake up call for me. And, really a glimpse into my own issues. And that's really when I started to really get into addiction medicine. Now we're talking all the way back to 2007. But that's when I started to realize that, like, my older brother, who had struggled with opioid addiction for a decade at that point, and had been abusing drugs since he was around 14 or 15. I always looked at us very different. Like, we're just wired differently. And that was really the wake up call for me that, like, we're actually not maybe wired all that differently. And I've removed alcohol from my life. It's been over 10 years for me since I've drank alcohol. And I didn't have to go through any kind of to like detox program or inpatient treatment, but I think it very much helps me relate, to patients, because it was such a big part of my life. And I remember those conversations of, like, my family saying, like, do you see now? Do you see why we get concerned? Do you see, and I would binge until I blacked out on the weekends. And that was like normal for like those of us in the service industry. Like we would wake up, not remembering the end of the night, and our coworkers and friends and colleagues and family members, like, telling us how the night ended. And like, that's not normal alcohol consumption,
and the script is flipped. The people who don't do that are the oddities.
Yeah, right.
It's very, in hindsight, it's very strange.
Yes, and that happens in other circles too. Like I was, not that long ago, I was talking to some Navy SEALs, and they were actually talking about how, like, if there was any Navy SEAL that would come through and he didn't go out drinking with them afterwards, it was like, I don't trust that guy, because he wasn't willing to, like, drink with them, and so it becomes a culture in college. It becomes a culture in the service industry. It becomes a culture in certain, aspects of military circles. And really, I think for a lot of people, and like you said, COVID was like gasoline on a fire, for so many people, because there were these responsibilities or other things that kind of kept them in check, like, well, I've got to go into the office for 8 to 10 hours today, so my alcohol consumption at least can't begin until evening. And COVID, working from home, working across Zoom, like, that opened up a lot of opportunities for alcohol to kind of creep in and even escalate for people who had already kind of, kept some boundaries around it. And I think we're still not, like, we know that alcohol sales skyrocketed through COVID. We know that alcohol consumption and people developing alcohol use disorder, where they were having consequences, related to their alcohol consumption, all of that increased. And we're seeing some of those people now coming out and seeking treatment. But a lot of them are still just consuming alcohol at home, and we're doing everything we can to help those people recognize that, like, that they need to get that under control, and it's very difficult to do that without help, without support, without medical treatment as well. And so, I just wanted to, let you know that your story, in fact, is very relatable to me. And in fact, to this day, just last week, and probably every month prior to that, like, I have a friend reach out from the service industry who, also it became problematic for them. And for some of them, it continued with the alcohol. For others, it kind of transitioned into other addictions, and whether it be benzodiazepines. I have a friend from the service industry that I'm helping, who's struggling with benzodiazepine use, another one with opioid use, and so it's, we live in a society, in our culture, addiction is almost a part of it, and if we're not talking about chemical substances, we're talking about addictions to, phones and the apps that are built on the neuroscience of addiction. Some people are addicted to rage, right? Like with this political climate, like that they're addicted to that feeling, that excitement, that adrenaline, and unfortunately, it's turned much of our country into what looks like a big dumpster fire.
Yes.
But it's something that, like, if we're not talking about it and if we're not getting this information and education out there, it's certainly not going to get any better. And hopefully, I agree, Laura, that this podcast, it's great. I think that so many of these episodes have turned out just to be fantastic, and getting great information out there, and also getting people to tell their story. Like, all of us identify through stories, through storytelling. Before the internet, before emails, even before the written word, everything was passed on through stories. Yeah. And stories help us kind of identify and relate, but also help us come up with a plan. Like, okay, well, if that person did it, let me hear about how they did it, and maybe that will work for me. And for all of those reasons, it's beneficial to have these conversations. And I commend you even for having the courage to do so. Because a lot of people, they may have to walk that pathway, but talking about it, particularly on a public forum like a podcast, a recorded podcast like that takes courage, that takes strength, and so I give you a lot of credit for that.
Thank you. I think you made a couple amazing points that really helped me start my journey, stay in my journey. And one, addiction takes so many forms, and it's the chemical makeup of our brains, that biology, but we stigmatize a few of them. And right. Rightly so, right? Some of these are very dangerous to us, but if we put in the context that we're all prone to this, if we let ourselves build this repetitive habit and learn behavior, and we let this, whether it makes us angry or whatever it does, flood us with these chemicals in our brains, that we can't avoid this, right? And we realize that we're out of control. And then you mentioned, feeling that you were wired differently than your brother. One of the books that I was listening to put the definition of alcoholism in a way that really resonated with me, and that alcoholism is the inability to not drink. It doesn't have anything to do with volume. The volume is problematic. The volume is killing me. But there are people who have a glass and a half of wine with dinner every night for their life, for 60, 70 years. They may have the same struggle not having that glass every night for a week that I have not having a drink, right? So if you think about it that way, like theirs might not be problematic. They're fine. Mine is problematic. But that inability to not have something, and when you realize that you're not abnormal, you're not broken, it's not your fault. For me anyway, it made it a lot easier to finally, after my last really bad drinking binge, to just finally say, I'm not good and I need help. Right. Because it no longer felt like it was my fault.
Right. Right. Yeah. And a lot of times it takes something like a legal consequence for me, like I'm a rule follower, so like to have a legal consequence, and that shame and that guilt and that, like, oh my God, that was a big wake up call for me. But for other people, it can be something a lot more subtle. And to your point, as an ER physician, I'm constantly bringing people in for various reasons. And every time somebody comes into the emergency department, we go through their medical history, their surgical history, their psychiatric history, and their social history. And their social history often includes, like, okay, do you smoke? Do you drink alcohol? Do you use illicit drugs? And it's always been interesting to me, in the 20 years that I've been practicing emergency medicine, that so many people will downplay that alcohol consumption whenever they do come to the ER. But even if they only do drink, 2 or 3 drinks in the evening, but they do that every single evening consistently, families are always shocked when that person goes into alcohol withdrawal. They think like, well, alcohol withdrawal, that's only for alcoholics. Like, Joe's not an alcoholic, John's not an alcoholic, but what they don't realize is that, like, the brain will become chemically dependent even on that small amount of alcohol. And if you take that away, then that person is going to go through the discomfort of physical withdrawal, and they may have a seizure, and they may go into DTs. Alcohol use disorder is defined by the DSM basically as consequences. Like, have you had social consequences, friendship consequences, legal consequences, vocational consequences? Are you showing up late for work or missing work? Are your friends concerned you're doing too much of it? Is it unexpectedly draining your bank account? Is it affecting basically your ability to fulfill your goals? And so for a lot of those people that are consuming alcohol, just in the evening, maybe, 4 beers every evening, they may not be able to recognize that, well, I'm not getting in any legal trouble. It doesn't seem to be impacting me in those negative ways. But then all of a sudden they're in the hospital and they don't have access to alcohol, and they're in withdrawal, or they go on a trip where they don't have access to alcohol, and now they're in withdrawal, and now all of a sudden it is resulting in those kind of consequences. But I really love the way that you put that, is that, like, it's not always like the inability to stop. It's the inability to not pick something up and put it in your body. And when we get people into treatment for addiction, those are the things that are really important to focus on, because for so many people, we'll put them on this medication and that blocks their ability to use that chemical, or another medication that blocks their ability to use that chemical. Well, for so many of those people, if you're not addressing the underlying issues and you're not sort of approaching it in a comprehensive manner, then they're just going to reach for a different substance that's going to provide, that same benefit to them. And that it just shows, how complex all of this is. Our brains are very complex. As human beings, our lives are complex. And when you add a substance into it, it can increase that complexity in so many ways.
So I know Josh sent me a video on the Sinclair Method. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if is that sort of related to, is it naltrexone, right? Is that how we're saying it?
The medicine, yeah.
So do you guys want to start getting into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Doctor, you want to start, that way we can lay out,
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with naltrexone and kind of explaining like what naltrexone is and mm-hmm. how it works in the brain. So naltrexone is what's called an opioid receptor antagonist. Antagonist means like kind of a blocker. It binds to the receptor, but it doesn't activate that receptor. And it also has a very high affinity for that receptor, meaning like when it's bound to the receptor, it's not letting other things bind to that receptor. So in a sense, it blocks the receptor, and that's that's sort of the pharmacologic way in which it works. What's interesting about naltrexone is it makes perfect sense why it works for conditions like opioid use disorder, right? Like you block that opioid receptor, and if that person consumes opioids, well, those opioids aren't going to get onto the receptor, so they're not going to feel anything, and so it makes sense why it works. It was actually FDA approved for alcohol use disorder before it was approved for opioid use disorder, and that was a bit of a surprise to a lot of people in the scientific community, because we know that alcohol doesn't bind to the opioid receptor. Alcohol binds to the GABA receptor, and that's the receptor that slows everything down. That's the same receptor. The GABA receptor is the one that benzodiazepines, like Valium and Klonopin and Xanax, that's the receptor that it binds to, and the same receptor that alcohol binds to. So, if you think about that, like, well, if naltrexone is blocking the opioid receptor, why is that helpful at all for somebody who consumes alcohol? Well, what it turns out that we now know that we didn't know back then, when these studies were first being done, is that if a person is on naltrexone, they can still consume alcohol in a sense that they're not going to get violently ill or sick. That's antabuse. That's a different medication. If somebody's on antabuse and they consume alcohol, they're going to get violently ill. That doesn't happen with naltrexone. But what happens is when a person drinks alcohol and they're on naltrexone, they will still get all of the slowing down effects of the alcohol, meaning like they'll still have slurred speech. They'll still be impaired, from a motor activity standpoint. They'll still get hungover the following morning. They can still get a DUI if they're driving because of that impairment. But what we now know is that after alcohol binds to that GABA receptor, there's a backdoor mechanism through the opioid receptor in which all of those good feelings are coming from. So everything from like, that happy buzz whenever, you first start consuming, to the progression of that where it feels like your problems have melted away and it feels like you don't have a care in the world. Most people, when they consume alcohol and they're on naltrexone, they'll tell you that they don't get those same good feelings. They don't get that happy buzz. They don't get that euphoria. They don't get the feeling that like, they don't have any more problems in the world. Most of them will say like, well, I only experience kind of the negative. I only experience like the slowing down of everything and, the not feeling well the next morning. And so, for that reason, it is FDA approved for alcohol use disorder, because when you give it to people who struggle with alcohol use disorder, they consume less alcohol over time because it breaks that association with that good feeling. Now, there's also there's some interesting things about naltrexone that a lot of people don't know. One of them being in a different study that they did, when they do these studies, it has to be a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized study. You have two groups of randomized people that are relatively equivalent as far as like the demographics and the population that makes up those groups. One group gets a placebo, the other group gets the actual medication, and then you have to subtract to the placebo effect to see, what is that drug actually doing? And some of these studies, they've shown that people who've never touched substances in their life, like, for instance, like it showed little old ladies who buy lottery tickets, they'll actually reduce the number of lottery tickets that they buy by about 40%. So there's a lot more happening with that opioid receptor than we realize. There's a lot more happening in that limbic system and in that pleasure reward pathway, than we realize. And there's so many different components of addiction, starting from like just the visualization. If somebody sees something that reminds them of the substance that they used to use, it's going to kind of trigger their brain to start down that pathway. And for other people, it's the ritual itself. Like, we've had people in the world of addiction. This is always an interesting story. People are alarmed to hear this, but I've had several people in the world of addiction who they weren't injecting heroin anymore because they couldn't afford heroin. They were injecting saline. They were literally injecting like just like salt water, that's equivalent to like IV fluids, because it's the pulling back of the plunger and seeing that little blood blush and the flushing of the plunger, like just that ritual in itself can be euphoric for some people. And that's almost like, that's like the placebo effect, right? Like they're not actually getting an opioid. They're getting that placebo effect just from the ritual itself. And regarding the placebo effect, there's something that we should clarify there. Like a lot of people think like a placebo effect is, oh, that's just in your head. That's actually the opposite of that. It's so much not in your head. It's so much actually causing a physical change in your body that we have to measure that physical change. If you're convinced that this pill is going to lower your blood pressure, your brain is so powerful that it will actually lower your blood pressure in response. And that's the same as true as lowering your blood sugar or lowering your cholesterol, so like, that's what we mean whenever we say like our brains are so much more powerful than we even realize. Just by convincing the brain that something will happen, it increases the chance that thing will happen. And that's very interesting whenever we talk about these medications, because we have to subtract that placebo effect to see what the drug is actually doing. But with naltrexone, we can clearly see some things that it's doing, which is breaking that association between alcohol consumption and pleasure, and making alcohol consumption less enjoyable, so that if that person does relapse, well, it's not going to reawaken that dopamine wave and that euphoria in the same sense as it would if they didn't have that medication in their system.
So I wanted to ask, Josh brought this up yesterday when we were speaking. And when I say yesterday, I don't know if this is a Western Pennsylvania thing. It could have been like last Monday, right? But we're like yesterday when we were talking, he did bring up, and you did bring it up as well, how if you're on naltrexone and you do opioids and you're not getting that same feeling, there's a little bit of a worry there, right? With someone. So you wouldn't prescribe this to someone who was trying to get off of opioids. Yes. Because if they were using while on this and not getting that feeling, could they continue to use and use and use to try to get that high? And then,
so just to clarify, you said opioids, you meant alcohol.
I think we're touching on opioids. The thing I mentioned to Laura, I wanted to make sure we didn't, push too hard. And the things that I've read in my looking into this medicine is that it increases the risk of overdose. If anybody's on it for opioid use and they decide to use, the risk of overdosing, especially if somebody takes the shot form of naltrexone that's in your body for a month, that there are studies that it increases the risk of overdose, that it's very likely because it blocks it, but you're already in the state of mind that I want to feel high on this, that your risk of overdose ends up being higher, and there are a lot of deaths from it.
So that's not correct. So okay. MAT in general, all of the MATs, they significantly reduce the likelihood of overdose and death. But what you're reading about and where that's coming from is if you have somebody who is determined to do that drug, let's say, opioids being the obvious case. So the naltrexone has a very high affinity. Affinity is magnetism, in the world of pharmacology. Like if we say something has a high affinity for a receptor, that means it has a very strong magnetism to that receptor, and then it's going to bind in there very tightly and not easily come off. Well, naltrexone does have a very high affinity for that receptor, so it binds on there very tightly. So, if somebody is on naltrexone, and they shoot IV heroin, they're not going to feel anything because the affinity of the heroin pales in comparison for that receptor compared to the affinity, of the naltrexone bind to that receptor. However, if that person is like absolutely determined that they're going to get high, they'll do their normal of say 1 or 2 bags. That won't work. Then they'll say, okay, I'm going to double that. I'm going to do 6 to 8 bags. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, I'm gonna do 10 bags. Okay, that didn't work because it's not going to overcome the affinity, the binding of that naltrexone to that receptor. But if they keep pushing that, eventually, if they do 50 to 100 bags, eventually they will overwhelm the affinity of that naltrexone bound to that opioid receptor. And I always warn patients about that. Like there's absolutely no point in doing that because you won't get high. You're not going to, when you overcome that receptor, you have to do so much of it that if you are able to overcome the affinity of the naltrexone bound to the receptor, it's just going to immediately shut off your breathing and you're going to die. Thankfully, people do have a desire to get high, but they don't tend to have a desire to just be dead. So we don't see that happen very often. But it is a consideration, and you have to warn people about it. And if I have somebody who isn't even interested in decreasing their opioid use, and they're saying like, hey, whatever you do, I'm going to find a way to get high, then yes, I would not use naltrexone because they would be more likely to go down that pathway of just doing as much as they need to do until they're going to get a feeling that they're pursuing, and in which case, by the time they overcome the affinity of that receptor, their entire system is just going to get flooded. It's going to shut off their breathing, and they're not going to wake up from that. So in that sense, can it increase the likelihood of overdose? Yes, but only in a very, very, very tiny specific type of person. For most other people, if they're on naltrexone, they may relapse, and they may even say like, that doctor was probably full of it. I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to snort this line of oxy, or I'm going to shoot that heroin. But then when they do it, they don't feel anything. That person is not likely to continue wasting their money, and trying it again and again. Only the very, very determined, person who's trying to overcome the effect of that naltrexone would be at higher risk of death. But we do not see higher numbers of overdoses in people that are on naltrexone. It's actually the opposite of that. We see way less overdoses because those people tend to not be able to get high, as long as they're showing up and getting that shot every month.
Got it. Yeah, my concern was that if we talk about the Sinclair method and being able, if somebody chooses to drink while on it, to change their relationship, somebody may equate that to opioids and it's not been tested that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
This episode is brought to you by R.W. McDonald & Sons Incorporated, Robert Stevens Jewelers, Thank you to our sponsors for your support on our first season of the Alter Ego podcast. Be sure to click the link in bio for your discount for BetterHelp Therapy online. 10% off your first month.
And Josh, why don't you go ahead and you can explain a little bit about what you know about the Sinclair Method and your familiarity with it, and then I'll kind of give you the medical perspective on it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that is wildly counterintuitive. You know, you think you take this pill an hour before you want to drink, or you might drink, or the opportunity's there, and that you can drink. Somebody with alcohol use disorder, somebody like me. I think the great way that the book that Dr. Sinclair wrote explains it is it's kind of the idea of Pavlov's dog, which most of us have heard that told ad nauseum. You know, Pavlov rang the bell and the dog gave the dog food, rang the bell, gave him food, rang the bell, gave him food. Over time, that bell becomes the trigger. The dog salivates, dopamine, the happy hormones flood the dog's brain. And, you know, he won the Nobel Prize for this. The book goes on to explain that the Nobel Prize was awarded for his study in learned behavior and behavioral extinction, taking away that learned behavior. So he was actually able to begin giving the dog food without the bell, making it to the point where the bell no longer was that relationship for the dog. And that's kind of what naltrexone, from what I understand, does. As you take that pill an hour before you get to drink, it gets on high affinity and bonds to those opioid receptors. And if you do decide to consume alcohol and you're blocking that flood of dopamine, over time you begin to change that body's connection of, even for me, the thought of alcohol. I mean, I work in alcohol. It made it very hard. I see the bottles of wine all day long. My thought is, when is my workday done? I'm going to have something. I'm going to pick something up on the way home, you know, and it shuts that off. I've been on it for a year and a half, and actually I just looked at the calendar, and today is my 18-month anniversary. So
nice.
Yeah.
You know, I travel the road. I started this just under a year and a half ago now, and I travel and I cover 17 states. And it used to be that I go out, I you know, show the wine, I sell the wine, I go and I do wine events and I host wine dinners, and I have 6 glasses in front of me, and every single day in my head I'm like, don't have any more, don't drink any tonight, like, and eventually that triggers on. You can't fight that chemical imbalance, the chemical flood. And I'd get to the hotel and I would have 2 martinis, and I'd go up to the room and I'd have a bottle of whiskey or a beer that I picked up or something, and before you know it, I've had everything. My wife's not there, my kid's not there, I can do whatever I want. And now, being on this medicine for a long time, I was incredibly conscious of it at the beginning, like pay attention to what I'm doing. But out of the gate, the trigger didn't flip on. Mm-hmm. And even now, I forget. I mean, I would send the glasses away. Now I have 6 glasses in front of me. I haven't touched them, even out of habit. Like at the beginning, I would grab it because that's what I do for 15, 20 years. That's what I do. I grab a glass of wine. Now, and, you know, I still think to myself, all right, you're going to get to the hotel, skip the bar. You don't need it. You've already had dinner. By the time I get to the hotel, I'm already in bed watching Netflix, and I'm like, I haven't even thought of it. Mm-hmm. I haven't even thought of it. It's just, to me, has been life-changing. I have tried AA. I've tried cold turkey. I went sober for a year and a half in 2014 through about almost 2015 and a half, 2016. And I have probably since COVID quit 45 times. I would say I quit every morning at 8 a.m. and started by noon. No, not that bad, but it was basically like every day. And the beginning of this, the relationship change with alcohol, especially for somebody who is completely surrounded by it, has been insane. The first time I heard of this was on Radiolab on NPR. There was a great episode years ago about it, but I feel, unfortunately, at the end of the episode, this gentleman decided not to take it and go out for a weekend, and then just went back down that road. So this is something I will need on my person for my life. If it's around me, if it's an opportunity, but even non-alcoholic beer. I cracked one the other day, 4th of July. I had 3 sips of it. And even my wife said, she's like, you didn't even touch it. I was like, I forgot. She's like, I can't believe how different it is. I would drink a 12-pack of M&E beer, just like you were saying about the saline and the injection. That same ritual effect of having this, and it has just turned off this obsessive impulse to imbibe.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to interrupt, but do either of you know like a percentage of people that have that same sort of reaction to this? I mean, that's basically because it says, you know, the medicine works best if you do drink on it, which you know, people would think is counterintuitive, but it is that trying to get you to not drink. right?
Through the Sinclair Method, they've done, the book will tell you there's a multitude. I should have grabbed the numbers for here, but they've done many, many studies, double-blind placebo, randomized, and they're at about an 87% effective rate of people reducing or eliminating their drinking. And a large percent of that are folks that, so my problem with alcohol, I know it, and I mentioned this to you yesterday when we spoke, is that I know, and I can admit it to myself now, the first time I ever got drunk, I loved it. And I knew in my head, this might be a problem for me one day. If I look back and I'm honest with myself, I have friends who don't like the feeling of being drunk. They hate it, so they never get drunk. And it would follow that if somebody feels that way, why wouldn't somebody love it? Why, if we all have our different experiences with it. So, I have to be ready to quit drinking. And if I'm in a mindset where like, I want to get drunk again, that's where people fall off this. You have to know that this is it. You're going to fall down the same dark path. This is your safety net. But for me, in my experience and from those studies, it has such an enormous success rate. But is, from what I understand, is so very underprescribed. And I think part of it is that how do you say as a doctor, take this and go have a drink to somebody who has a very severe problem with drinking?
Yeah. And let me comment a little bit on that, because, that's one of the reasons why, so let me start sort of at the beginning. I don't encourage people to consume alcohol under any sort, just like we don't, encourage people to consume opioids. And I think that's part of the reason why, physicians, like many physicians are willing to prescribe naltrexone. And then, we'll get into a little bit of the difference between like treatment and harm reduction and kind of where the Sinclair method falls in that. But to start, like we should review, like what are the happy hormones, like what we call the happy hormones. There's actually 4 of them. So, dopamine is one of them. Our natural endorphins is another one. Serotonin is another one. And oxytocin is actually the 4th one. So we have 4 happy hormones. These are the neurotransmitters that when released into the synapse of our brain, we feel good and we feel happy. And also that our neuroplasticity actually changes to continue to pursue that behavior, because our brains like being happy. And those molecules, dopamine, natural endorphins, serotonin, and oxytocin, they typically come from things that are good. Like, for instance, when your baby's born, what's the first thing they do? They put it on mom's chest, right? Why? Because it increases fetal maternal bonding. Well, the neurochemistry shows that there's a massive release of oxytocin in both the brain of mom and the brain of baby whenever that baby is put bare skin, on mom's chest immediately after it comes out of the womb. Well, our brains have evolved over time that anytime they get one of those 4 happy hormones, the dopamine, the serotonin, the natural endorphins, or the oxytocin, to change in a way to promote that behavior, even more down the pipeline. So one of the things that naltrexone is doing is it's breaking that association. Our brains are very good at associating things. When I do that, I get a good outcome. When I do this, I get a bad outcome. That association then gets incorporated into the wiring of our brain so that in the future we can better navigate our lives, right? Like we can stay away from the things that are dangerous and harmful and destructive, and we can move towards the things that not only bring us happiness and joy, but result in positive outcomes. That's how our brains are typically moving forward, based on every external experience, that we are receiving. That's how neuroplasticity works. With naltrexone, you break the association between when I do this, it feels good, or when I do this, I get dopamine. And not only is there the break of that association and consumption, meaning like, okay, every time I consume this alcohol, my brain's getting that chemical. Well, my brain is going to continue to change to promote me continuing that behavior because it wants those happy hormones. There is, even before you put the alcohol or whatever the drug is, right? Like, and let's talk about Pavlov, it's the food, right? Like before you even put the food into the mouth, there's the ritual, there's the bell. And what's interesting is our brain already starts releasing those chemicals before the substance even gets into our body. That's probably why it's breaking that association between little old ladies who gamble and wanting to buy those lottery tickets, right? Because just the fact of buying the lottery ticket, like, you have to win to actually, for that to release a massive wave of dopamine. But those chemicals are also getting released just with the excitement of maybe I might win, maybe this might go well for me. And so you can see how it's going to break that association of like the bell, and the salivating, or seeing the alcohol or smelling the alcohol, and then your brain sort of continuing down that pathway of wanting to, consume. So, that's one part of it. And when we come to, like the whole aspect of it works better when you drink on it, you got to be careful with how you say that. It's not so much that it works better when you drink on it. It's that when you drink on it and you don't get that dopamine effect, it's breaking that association in your brain between, oh, I consume that and then I feel good. Therefore, it's going to also break that association of seeing it and it's starting that same pathway and process, because it's stopping those happy hormones. And in this case, it's dopamine. It's stopping that dopamine from being released. And that dopamine release starts just with the anticipation. That's actually, there have been some really interesting studies done on that. You can take somebody who's in withdrawal and just tell them like, hey, no problem, we're going to get alcohol right now. Or, hey, look, we got a little bag of dope, we got a little stamp bag. And immediately their withdrawal symptoms actually start to decrease because their brain is already releasing that chemical. Remember, like when we do drugs, like we're not consuming dopamine, we're not injecting dopamine, right? Like we're doing a chemical that is causing our brains to release the dopamine that's already in there. And so it makes sense that your brain starts to release that dopamine because it has made that association between that activity and that neurotransmitter being released. So, with this Sinclair method, I always remind people, like, it's not that it works better if you consume alcohol, it's that's going to break that association. I prescribe naltrexone all the time, and I do prescribe it to people who are actively drinking, because if that person is expressing a desire to want to decrease that alcohol consumption, what better way than I can do it than break the association between it feeling good and that euphoria that they're going to experience, or that happy buzz, or their problems melting away. If I can break that positive feeling away from that activity, then I'm going to have much more success in getting them to continue to decrease that activity. But if they take the naltrexone and just by taking the naltrexone and blocking that opioid receptor, if they're not having cravings to consume alcohol, I'm not going to encourage them like, well, you should consume alcohol because that's going to do a better job of breaking that association. So that's what I mean whenever I say, like, we have to be very careful there. It's not so much that they're told to go out and consume alcohol. It's that the consumption of alcohol just further breaks that association between, the activity but ultimately, like, whether a person is going to continue in their recovery and decrease their alcohol consumption or not, it has just as much to do with the phases of change, right? Like, we know from a psychology standpoint that the phases of change from pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and that cycle that it kind of goes around, like, if somebody's still in that pre-contemplation phase, pre-contemplation is like, I don't have a problem, I don't know what you're talking about. Contemplation is that like what you actually had when after your first drink, like, okay, that could be a problem for me someday, and it increases from there, wherever that person is on that phase of change. As long as they're in pre-contemplation, we have a chance, we can make some progress. But if somebody's in way before that, where they're not even willing to recognize that it's a problem, or having the desire to want to decrease it, it's not likely that, we're going to make a whole lot of success. And so I try and, introduce things at the appropriate phase of change, and then explain, look, if we're doing harm reduction, that would be more of a situation where, like, look, I'm going to keep drinking. Okay, well, would you be willing to take this naltrexone while you continue your drinking? And that may be very, very effective for that person. And that's more fitting with like a Sinclair method type of approach, that I would find myself in. But I wouldn't be a physician. Morally and ethically, I don't think I could say like, well, I know you haven't had a drink in 2 weeks, but when you go home tonight and you're taking this naltrexone, I want you to consume a few beverages. there may be some physicians out there that morally and ethically, they can align with that. For me, I'm happy to just have the ability to break that association between, that particular behavior and that particular result, and move them further along that sobriety pathway.
Yeah, that's why I've said I feel that people have to be ready and willing and wanting to stop
100%.
and use this to break it. Because by no means, I don't mean to imply that you should continue to drink a bottle of whiskey every night with this and you're good, you're fine, don't worry about it. Not at all. And I do, any of my friends who I know are still struggling or maybe aren't to the point where they know they need to stop yet, that's the conversation I have. I'm like, hey, why don't you just go? So I went to Monument Alcohol Therapy online. That's how I got mine. And I'm like, why don't you just go on? And you don't even ask for it. They offer you Antabuse or this, and take the naltrexone, and why don't you please just try it and see what it'll do for you. And see it all. But I personally, I don't drink on the alcohol, I'm sorry, on the naltrexone. Because of my job, I feel that I'm sort of in a hybrid version of Sinclair Method. Because of my work, there are actual legitimate, for the first time in my alcohol career, times that I do need to taste alcohol. And for the first time in a year and a half, it is simply tasting. But I think that having that medicine, knowing I have an event or a dinner or a trade show or just whatever's coming into my industry, I can plan for that. I take that pill. And in the past year and a half, it has never turned that switch on for me because I'm able to plan for it. And now I also know if I don't have that pill, I guess I'm tasting tomorrow.
Yeah. I'm
not in for today. Sorry. And, at the beginning, the shame is built in. I didn't really talk about it. I didn't really say anything. And it's funny. I think everybody probably gets to that point of shame. And that's the hardest part of coming out and saying, hey, I'm really deep and dark and I need help. And now within the industry, I'm finding such an amazing support group where I'm like, hey, I quit drinking a long time ago because I just can't do it. And so many people are like, that's incredible. It's so hard in this industry. It's amazing. Like, nobody cares. It was so much of my own anxiety that everybody around me cared. They care, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether they care that I wasn't going to have a drink. I think, Laura, you said this the other day, you have some friends that are like, oh, you're doing that again.
Yeah. Cause I've recently, sort of been toying around with the idea of not drinking because I feel like it's something I've been using as a crutch for like my mental health. And when I'm finding myself going home and the first thing I want to do is have a drink, like, meanwhile, my dog's like, let's go, let's get outside. And I'm wanting to pour that glass of wine right away. And I'm just so conscious of it where I'm like, well, something about this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like it aligns with me and who I am and what my goals are and where I'm at right now. And I just have been struggling a little bit with that and talking to Josh about it and saying like, I don't know, I'm sort of feeling like maybe this is something I want to do because for me, my struggle is having people that they have this sort of negative reaction where they're like, oh, you're going to try to not drink again, huh? Well, let's see how that works. Ha ha. And it's like funny. I'm like, no, I'm telling you this because I need your support. And if I don't have your support, then I know that I need to maybe distance myself, which isn't a good feeling either. But when you're genuinely saying, no, I think I need to really step away from it. I need to not make it a thing where I have anxiety about going to a concert or going to someone's house for a dinner or even just going out to dinner and feeling good about not wanting to get a drink. And when someone's like, oh, why don't you just have a glass of wine? It's like, no, like I don't want to drink at all. Like I don't want any alcohol. I did it once before, but for me, it's stuff like that. It's maybe having something where if there is an event, I could take something and know like, I don't want this to get out of control, right? I don't want to be doing tequila shots, which inevitably is what ends up happening, right? So it just does. And this is something I'm talking about on here, just putting it out there because it's a real thing for me. And it is sort of that, talking to Josh. And I mean, you messaged me, I want to say, maybe right after the podcast launched.
Yeah, the first or second one, yeah.
And, people say that kind of stuff will happen. And I just was like, well, let's just see what happens here. Obviously, I'm starting this and we're doing this and having this conversation. And when you sent me that message about, where you were and making this change in your life, and us having known each other and been friends, I was sort of blown away, because then I thought, okay, so maybe I'm not really alone in how I'm feeling.
Yeah. And I think that was the beginning. I think it was around January. That was the beginning of me being like, I just need to start saying it out loud. Like, it's all right. It's fine. And I felt putting out so much great, positive, comfortable space help for people. I think it was great. I think that week reached out to somebody who wrote an article in like the New Yorker or something in New York, and touched on naltrexone. And I sent her a message and just said, hey, if this is something you ever want to expand on, I will happily share my story, because if I can pay it forward, if 1, 2, 10 people find this and begin to undo this pattern of behavior that they've developed in their life. And, and Dr. Brophy, I don't know what you think. Where do you see this as like is this something that could be preventative measures for people, like early intervention, I guess I should say, for alcohol? For someone like me, say 20 years ago, I'm like, hey, like, I like this too much. How do I get ahead of this? Is this something that could be more mainstream, that's more accessible for people? Because it isn't expensive either. My prescription's $13 a month.
Right.
With insurance. Without insurance, it's $100. And if you're a problematic drinker, that's a week of drinking. Right. So it's going to even out. Is this something that could become more mainstream, more accessible for somebody who's like, I don't want to get there, but I want to be able to go out on the weekend, one night a week, and know that I'm not blowing up that night and turning it into 7 and turning it into 4 in the morning.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because, I touched a little bit upon this earlier, but like, if we're not at that phase of change where like, somebody is ready to, even if they're, not ready to, make any changes, right? Like, well, I'm not going to decrease my consumption of alcohol. I'm not going to decrease my use of heroin, whatever it may be. That doesn't mean that like we don't do anything, right? Like we still try and embrace harm reduction. Harm reduction is everything from like a safe injection site. Like, okay, well, if you're going to do that heroin, like let's do it in a way that is safe and secure. Harm reduction can also be in a way like, okay, well, if you're going to continue drinking, would you at least consider taking this medication that will break that association, between that alcohol consumption and what your brain is sort of craving from it, the dopamine wave, and breaking that association can only really benefit those people over time if the goal is, to decrease their alcohol consumption over time. The conversation that I'll typically have with people if they come in and they're consuming alcohol, it particularly, if they say, I want to decrease my alcohol consumption, I go through the MAT options, because there's other ones besides naltrexone too. And a lot of times when I bring up antabuse, I'll say like, well, this is the one that, you get violently ill if you consume alcohol, and you have to be careful, to make sure that your mouthwash doesn't have alcohol, and you don't take NyQuil that has alcohol, these kind of things. A lot of people will say like, no. Like that's not what I'm looking for. Like, I'm not looking to cut alcohol out of my life. Then naltrexone becomes like a very logical, next step. And you're right, the oral naltrexone is very affordable. The injectable is a lot more. It's about $1,000 a month. But the oral naltrexone you can get for, under $100 a month. And with those, the where you kind of see, where the rubber meets the road is if you prescribe that for 30 days, are people going to take it for 30 days? Because, what a lot of people will do is like when the weekend's coming up, they'll say like, I kind of want that feeling, I kind of want that euphoria. I want that happy buzz. And that plays more into, this human psychological need that we all have in our brains of wanting to reward ourselves, right? Like what you were talking about, Laura, like getting home after a hard day and being like, I need a drink, or after a hard week, like, I need to have some fun this weekend, and particularly in this world we live in with this much stimulation and this much stress, like I think people are feeling that more than ever. People are feeling like, I need a break from this craziness, this crazy political climate, this crazy, like constant stimulation on our phones and everything is competing for our attention. And that makes, we're all in this like constant sympathetic overstimulation. Everything makes us feel fight, flight, or freeze, because everything is red banners and sirens, trying to get our attention, because it all has to compete for that same level of attention. And the more we can stimulate somebody's emotions, whether it be anger, agitation, anxiety. Like, we're more likely for them to not think logically and just pay attention to whatever it is that we're going to put in front of them. So, for that reason, I think we're seeing so many people, that we're able to kind of keep it at bay and keep it to just the weekends. Now, all of a sudden it's creeping into, every aspect of their life. But to answer your question, do I see naltrexone being something that's used even a little bit earlier, even whenever we're starting to see that pattern of drinking increase? Yes, absolutely. As long as we can get the person on board with that, then it's a worthwhile pursuit, because, there are some side effects with naltrexone, that you have to talk about, and you have to have that full conversation of like, look, if you have this in your system, it blocks the opioid receptor. Well, okay, what sort of, consequences and conversation come with that? It may cause, some yawning and stretching, in some people, and like, you just have to have that thorough conversation. But I do think that over time, we're going to see physicians becoming more comfortable with prescribing it, because even just 10 years ago, PCPs weren't really prescribing it, and internal medicine docs weren't really prescribing it. And really was only being used in the world of addiction medicine. Now you're seeing, I just got a patient in last week who I said, who's prescribing your naltrexone? My PCPs had me on it for about 2 years, and I hope that the more we educate people on, the benefits of it, that we get not just patients being more acceptable and more willing to give it a try, but also get that comfort level in the medical community as well.
Yeah, that'd be great to see that become more mainstream as an option.
I hope so as well. Laura, I actually have to jump off.
No, thank you for your time. You gave us so much more of your time than I. Seriously, you're a rock star, man. Like in this town, and just thank you for talking to us. And I'll reach out again. I mean, like I said, I'm a one-woman show over here, and sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, it's already July, and I have all these things that I want to do and touch back with people. So
don't stop, because you're doing great things, and honestly, it's an honor to be a part of this.
Thank you.
So you can count me in anytime.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Brophy.
Thank you too, Josh.
Gotta give you that. Yeah, Dr. Brophy! I had to do it. Thank you for tuning in to Alter Ego. Join me every Monday for a new episode, and be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Follow us on Instagram at Alter Ego Podcast. Until next time, stay safe, stay hopeful, stay kind.